The Stonewall attack is an annoying system for many chess players to deal with, and in this video Grandmaster Max Illingworth, will show you how to deal with it. Now, for those who don't know, the Stonewall attack is where white goes for this pawn chain of pawns on f4, e3, d4, and c3, basically trying to tie up the board and eventually go for an attack on the king side with the help of the e5 square. And the backstory for this video is I actually played an over-the-board Blitz game for the first time in 1 year against a player with FIDE rating of 1700, and this is just a very nice example for me of how to play against a Stonewall attack. So I hope that you'll enjoy it, and after this game you will have a very good idea of how to play against a Stonewall. If you are relatively new to the channel, do make sure to like the video and also subscribe to the channel for more like this. Because this How to Beat, I feel like it's going to be a pretty fun series to get into over this month of October. But yeah, in terms of the move order, the first step to beating the Stonewall is basically making sure that you don't shut in your bishop with a move such as e6. Because let's say if you play a move like e6, then white suddenly gets quite a nice position here with something like knight e5. Because what white wants to do is basically, let's just say we play queen c7 for argument's sake. Basically, white wants to go for moves like g4, g5, sort of swing the queen or the rook into the attack to h3 or g3, and just go for a big attack on our king. And if we're not careful with the move order, this attack can actually be very dangerous to deal with. So that's white's idea, and you might be wondering, well, how exactly do we deal with this? So the step one is basically to make sure that you develop your light squared bishop here outside the pawn chain before playing e6. Since the f5 square is already covered by the white bishop, this is why I played the move bishop to g4 in the game. And after knight f3, then the move e6, so the bishop is no longer shut in. We had castles. I played the move bishop to e7. Yeah, maybe in hindsight, bishop d6 might be a tad more precise and a bit more active, but the difference is, I think, pretty marginal. My opponent played the move of queen to e1 here. If you are wondering what to do if they play h3, I kind of like the idea of even playing a move such as bishop f5, where the game continuation will kind of show that the double pawns are actually not that big of an issue here, because they do help you to fix the e4, e3 pawn and give you the e4 square as an outpost. But that's going to come up in the game, because after queen e1, castles, and now my opponent's move of knight bd2, now we get to part two of how to win against the Stonewall. So step one was get their bishop outside the pawn chain, and step two is basically to trade off their good bishop. And if you want to be able to tell what's a good bishop and what's a bad bishop, then you can use Capablanca's rule of thumb of looking at the pawn structure. So because white's pawns are on the dark squares, this means that white has a good bishop on d3, right? And by the same token, the bishop on c1 is a bit stuck behind the pawns. It can't really develop so actively. And so that's how I came up with the move of bishop f5. So step two is to trade off their good bishop for our not as good bishop. And my opponent actually went for the exchange voluntarily. If they don't play bishop takes f5, your general plan is going to be to kind of keep the tension between the bishops and just sort of open up the queen side in your favor. That is where your pawn chain is pointing. So it's quite logical to play on that side of the board. And meanwhile, white's king side attack with moves like g4, g5, it's just going to be a lot less effective without the light squared bishops to kind of support it in a way. So in a position like this, well, it turns out they can't even really play queen takes d3 because that is going to leave the g4 pawn on free. But at the same time, if I have to play a move like knight d3 and move the knight away and give us a very easy plan of later expanding on the queen side, then that's obviously not going to be ideal for white either. G5 just isn't really that scary when our knight can kind of maneuver around to f5 and just lock down the king side in our favor that way. But you don't really have to worry too much about it getting mated in this sort of position. But it's a little bit of a digression from the game, which saw white take on f5. And then we get to see that even though I have double pawns here, the double pawns aren't really a weakness because they're also keeping that e3 pawn fixed in place. And in fact, this position is going to be clearly better for black. And one thing you might also notice is that now that the E file is half open, I don't really have to worry as much about trying to open up a second front on the queen side, because I already have that open file to kind of work with. And when you have a much better position like this, you can start to think a little bit more defensively, where you don't have to be so fixated on, oh, how do I attack the opponent? We sort of get to step three, which is to kind of consolidate the position and just sort of make it that your strategic trumps are just become more and more of a factor as the game goes on. So yeah, step three is kind of making sure all the pieces are on good squares, just kind of neutralizing the opponent's counterplay. And with rook f3, my opponent clearly wants to try to create some sort of attack against my king. And so that's why I started to play a little bit prophylactically and played this move of bishop f8. Keep in mind this is a blitz game, so just trying to be a little bit practical as well and just make the decisions easy for myself, which is something I often will teach my private students as well in our lessons. But yeah, after rook h3, just to move g6, just kind of builds a really safe home for my king, as it were. So if they play queen h4, I can play bishop g7 and know that the knight is covering this very well. And then, if they do play knight df3, okay, I can even play move like h6 and just not let their pieces in a sense. I mean, if they play a move like g4, that probably just weakens their king more than mine, because I do have four pawns around the king, keeping it very safe. Kind of reminds me a little bit of when I used to play four-player chess, this kind of defensive setup. But in the game, my opponent plays knight df3, and a good question to kind of ask when you're playing chess is a bit more of a high-level thinking technique, but when your opponent plays their last move, there are two really good questions that you can ask. And if you ask these questions on each turn, I think it will change the way in which you make your decisions. So you might want to make some notes here if you are watching this as a serious student of the game. And the first thing you can ask is, well, what is the opponent's threat, or what is the opponent's idea? So with knight df3, they probably want to go knight g5 and try to attack g7. So that's kind of the idea. The other really good question to ask, other than, what can they do now that they couldn't do before, is to also ask the question, well, what squares were kind of left behind by the opponent's last move? And what I mean by that is, well, what squares aren't as well protected now compared to when the knight was on b2? And what probably jumps out at you is that, okay, the e4 square is now completely undefended by white. And so I played the move knight e4, which doesn't just occupy the outpost, but it also covers the move knight g5 at the same time. And it turns out the position is already strategically winning for black, but I think the way my opponent played it probably made it a little bit easier for me, because even though after queen h4, so the thing with queen h4, I mean, I have to admit it's kind of hard to give white good advice at this point, although maybe I would have played a move like knight e5 and at least ask black how he'd defend the pawn before, before playing some other move. But you might notice again this theme that this bishop is just really stuck behind the pawns here. This is a sort of way of showing that the longer the game goes on, the better your position tends to get in the Stonewall when you're playing against it. And after queen h4, I'm also quite happy to trade the pieces, because the more the pieces get traded, the more these pieces being out of the game becomes a problem for white. And with the move of rook b8, I just am playing a little prophylactically, making sure my rook has a nice half-open file. And so you could say that's kind of step three, like once you've consolidated the position, step four is kind of using your long-term long-term strategic trumps, like using their bad bishop to your advantage, kind of finding a way to open the position to sort of create weaknesses in their position, or even just target their existing weaknesses. So it's kind of hard to give white good advice, because if you play bishop d2, obviously the b2 pawn can be taken, and if you play b3 trying to fianchetto the bishop, well, that opens the door for knight takes c3. So my opponent, in the kind of time trouble, he played the move rook b1, try and prepare bishop d2 without allowing the pawn on b2 to be taken. But this does have a little bit of a flaw to it, and you might want to put in the comments below what's the move that you would play in this position before I just give away the answer. It'll be interesting to see how many of you get it right, where I think for the more advanced people watching this, it'll probably be fairly easy, but I think for the majority, it'll make a good little puzzle. Now, to be fair, Black's position is so dominant that you could play almost any normal move and you would still be strategically winning. What I realized is that because this pawn on b2 is pinned, that opens the door for knight takes c3, where they can't take back because the rook takes b1 and the pin on the bishop to the king, which is an absolute pin. But after rook a1, we can now play the move 92. Thought about this move a bit in the game because I wasn't sure if I necessarily wanted to get rid of their bad bishop, but when I thought I was just picking off all their pawns with check, it made the decision a bit easier for me. Actually, when I was playing this over the board game, I was also doing a little bit of trash talking, which I suppose I didn't mention so much for this one, but okay, maybe for the next game. And yeah, he played the move of 91. I think he was nervous that I would play rook e2 and have the blind piece just devour everything. So he played 91 trying to anticipate that. But it also allows me to take on d4 and grab yet another pawn because, well, we are 4 pawns up here. And in the game, he fought a bit and took on c6. But yeah, that does just allow the next move. I remember I said something really funny at this point. I can't remember what the joke was I said. It was like very much in the moment. But I played move rook takes e1 and I remember what it was like I kind of, because the guy was like filming a video for his channel, I like asked his viewers to pause the video and like see if they could find the move. But yeah, rook takes e1 and yeah, it was just checkmate with the rooks covering it. So I think this was kind of a fun game and okay, it's of course true that it is, kind of easier to, play a really high quality game when your opponent is not like super high rated. But still I felt like this is a really nice model example of how to play against the Stonewall. And just to quickly recap what the steps were, step one was just making sure that you keep that diagonal open for the bishop so that you can play bishop g4, bishop f5 before playing e6. Because it might vary depending on the move order, right? Like say if they play f4, it allows you to put a bishop directly on f5. Like you don't need to play bishop g4 first in that sense. So you can kind of use your common sense like that. But just the general idea is we do want to get the bishop outside the pawn chain. That's step one. Step two then being to trade off their good bishop. So with bishop f5, like we saw in the game. Step three then is sort of just to consolidate the position, just sort of make sure our king is really safe, getting all of our pieces into the game to good squares as well, and just making it really hard for them to sort of attack our position. And then step four is basically to kind of just say that, the longer the game goes on, the more their kind of weaknesses in the bad bishop kind of come into play. Well, we can kind of see that even if white doesn't blunder in this position, that it's very hard for him to develop his bishop on c1 and by extension rook on a1. And then also this pawns on e3 is backward, the pawn on b2 is coming under fire. So it's just very hard for white to really free himself while we can just make our position better and better as things go on. So I hope that you found this one valuable. I really have kind of enjoying getting back into some YouTube content. I was kind of focusing a little bit more on poker in September, but kind of keen to focus a bit more on chess for this month. My sort of revolving door of changing interests. But yeah, basically, if you do enjoy this kind of how to beat series, I would certainly appreciate it if you let me know, whether it's by hitting the like button or saying in the comments. And speaking of the comments, if you do have any suggestions for topics you would like me to cover in this of how to beat series, then definitely quite open to that because there's a lot of ways you can look at it, right? You could choose how to beat certain players, how to beat players of a certain level, how to beat different openings, or how to beat the knight. There's a lot of ways you can kind of go with it, and I'm kind of excited yet to put kind of a new spin on, on chess. Because there was a Grandmaster times captain, it feels like okay, we're just doing the same old thing, but I think it's more fun for you guys as well if we mix it up, right? So yeah, you can expect some more content to come in the next days and weeks. And on that note, yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Take care.